All right, this lecture discussion is about the digestive system. The job of the digestive system is to break down the molecules in the food that we eat into smaller, more absorbable molecules that can be absorbed into the blood. So when you look at the digestive tract, that's those regions of the digestive system where food can pass. And this tract starts in the mouth as food enters the oral cavity. And then from there, it travels to the pharynx, which is the common passageway for both air and food, and then down into the esophagus. From the esophagus, it travels to the stomach, and the job of the stomach is to mix the food, physically, mechanically digest the food into smaller pieces, and put it into a liquid substance, which we call chyme. It's spelled C-H-Y-M-E. It's a liquid substance. It's the breakdown products of food in the stomach. And there's also some hormones and hydrochloric acid and mucus that is also produced in the stomach to help further digestion. And from there it passes into the first part of the small intestine, which is this curved region here called the duodenum. And the duodenum has the accessory organs of the gallbladder and the pancreas and the liver that secrete their contents into the duodenum. So this is the small first portion of the small intestine. And then throughout the small intestine, this larger central portion, the jejunum, is where a lot of absorption occurs. So when you think of the small intestine, you're thinking of absorption. That's where most of the absorption of nutrients occurs, is in the small intestine. And then toward the end of the small intestine, the small and final piece is called the ileum, where it then enters into the colon, where it's getting ready to be expelled from the body. But there's still a lot of water in this material that's being digested, so the job of the colon is to absorb that excess water and put that back to the blood. And there's some other functions as well that we'll talk about shortly. Notice that we have this appendix, this small offshoot of the cecum, the first part of the large intestine. And then we have the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and the descending colon. And then at the final portion of the colon is the sigmoid colon, kind of an S-shaped structure here at the end before it enters into the rectum. And once stool enters the rectum, then that stimulates a reflex that calls for eliminating that stool from the body. And the last and final piece is the anal canal, which has a internal and external sphincter. The external sphincter is under voluntary control, and that's when an individual can determine when it's convenient to move that bowel and have a bowel movement. So if we look at the upper GI, this is talking about the swallowing process, starting with the oral cavity to the pharynx to the esophagus, just bringing food into the body, into the stomach for that major digestive process to begin. We call that ingestion. So if somebody ingests some medicine, that means it's entered into the stomach, and that process of absorption is going to begin. Mastication is the process of chewing. It's just another name for chewing is mastication. And propulsion is the movement of food throughout the digestive tract. The first step in propulsion is just the simple swallowing process. When we swallow food and pass it into the pharynx from the oral cavity, there's a voluntary and involuntary portion of swallowing. The voluntary portion begins the process, so that's just moving that food into the pharynx. And then once it enters into the esophagus, we have these wave-like contractions of smooth muscle, which we call peristalsis. And this is an important term that you should associate with the digestive system, peristalsis. So that wave-like contraction of smooth muscle. And then segmentation is where we have movement of food kind of back and forth between the different portions. For example, of the small intestine, we see this movement that just breaks that food into smaller pieces. So it's a forward-backward motion, where peristalsis is more of a forward motion. Segmentation is just a mixing back and forth, kind of like if you would squeeze a toothpaste on opposite sides of where the toothpaste is. And the lower GI function is mixing, which occurs again through segmentation. Secretion is the process of secreting mucus and hormones and other digestive enzymes into the food that's being broken down. And digestion can be mechanical with chewing and churning in the stomach, or with the help of enzymes. We call that chemical. And then absorption is moving it to the blood, and elimination is eliminating it from the body. So when we talk about the process of digestion, we say that digestion begins in the mouth, particularly digestion of starches. So these are complex carbohydrates. And there's a special enzyme that we find in saliva which is called amylase, salivary amylase, and this breaks down starch. And this is why you can give a baby who has no teeth a saltine cracker, because that amylase enzyme in the saliva will break down that cracker into smaller pieces and eventually form a liquid which they can swallow. But there's other functions of saliva. It also prevents bacterial infection. There's some antibiotic compounds in the saliva to prevent infection. So that's important just between meals. We have food in our mouth, particles from previous meals that can feed bacteria in the mouth. We have natural bacteria in the mouth, and the saliva prevents infection. So it's important that we have good saliva production, and anybody who might be on a feeding tube won't have good saliva production because they're not chewing, they're not eating, and that slows saliva secretion, and therefore it's important to give them good oral care because that can increase bacterial counts in the mouth by not having as much saliva production with not eating. Lubrication, again, keeps our mouth moist, again preventing infection. It's important that we have the ability to lubricate our food when we swallow, that we form a bolus, which is just a chewed, lubricated mass of food in the oral cavity that enters the pharynx. So lubrication is very important. Again, any patient that's on a feeding tube is going to really struggle with a dry mouth because of low saliva production. So it's important that we give them some mouth moisturizers as well as good oral care to keep their mouth comfortable and moist. And then again, salivary amylase breaks down starch. So this next part of the digestive tract is the pharynx. Recall from lab we had the nasopharynx where food should not enter. That's from the uvula up into the nasal cavity. And the oropharynx is where food enters that vertical portion of the digestive tract. So the oropharynx is between the uvula and the epiglottis, and then the laryngopharynx is traveling behind the larynx here, so from the tip of the epiglottis to where these two passageways begin for air and food. So the laryngopharynx is the last part of the pharynx before food enters into the esophagus. And once food enters the esophagus, it undergoes peristaltic waves to move that food down to the stomach. So once food enters the esophagus, it cannot be brought up again because it's an involuntary process of those wave-like contractions. And at the end of this esophagus is a sphincter called the gastroesophageal sphincter, which is here, and that is sometimes weak in some individuals, and therefore they end up with acid reflux as the acidic contents of the stomach enter into the esophagus, and that can cause a painful burning sensation because the esophagus passes behind the heart. Some people confuse that with chest pain because it can cause discomfort in the chest as those acids enter into the delicate tissues of the esophagus. Once food enters into the stomach, then that's where this mixing and churning of food occurs to form that substance called chyme. Again, the spelling of that is C-H-Y-M-E, the liquid contents that is formed in the stomach. So we have this rhythmic peristalsis occurring at the top, at the fundus, down to the pylorus region of the stomach, just this mixing back and forth. And at the same time, we're secreting some important components into that digestive tract, namely mucus, then hydrochloric acid, intrinsic factor. This is an important hormone for absorbing vitamin B12 from our digestive tract. Pepsinogen, which is an enzyme for breaking down proteins, and then regulatory hormones. And one of those hormones is gastrin, which regulates the digestive process. Recall that the inside of the stomach has many folds that allows it to stretch well beyond its resting length. So that's what these rugae are, those wrinkles in the stomach wall allowing it to stretch. And if we look at the surface of the stomach, we can see there's these indentations here, these pits that are lined with all these different types of cells. And you'll go over the functions of these cells in more detail if you take advanced A&P. But you can see, what the names of those cells are and what they secrete.